11 a.m. Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. India time. Our guest today on today's show is M V Ramana, nuclear physicist working at the Princeton University. And our host for today's show is Shrikant Kocharlakota. And today's topic for discussion will be nuclear power, where the profit is privatized but the risk seems to be socialized. That's according to M V Ramana. So we'll find out why, how, and what goes into making all the big deals and the big news on the nuclear power. Ramana, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And
from this.
Thank you. Shrikant, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Suresh. Welcome to NRI Samay, live from Los Angeles, friends. This is your host, Shrikant. Wherever you are around the world, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Friends, today we are honored to have Mr. M V Ramana garu with us. And I will quickly introduce Ramana garu. Even before that, a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Ramana.
Thank you.
Okay, friends, so let me introduce Dr. M V Ramana here real quick. Dr. M V Ramana is a physicist working at Nuclear Futures Laboratory and the program on science and global security, both at Princeton University, on the future of nuclear power in the context of climate change and nuclear disarmament. Ramana garu is a member of the International Panel of Fissile Materials and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Science and Security Board. Dr. M V Ramana has written innumerous multiple papers and is author of The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India. I hope it's already published in 2011. I'll talk to Ramana garu on that soon. And he's a co-author of Prisoners of the Nuclear Dream, author of Bombing Bombay, Effects of Nuclear Weapons, and a case study of hypothetical explosion. And as far as education background of Dr. Ramana is concerned, M V Ramana garu obtained his PhD in physics from Boston University in 1994 and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Physics, University of Toronto, and the Center for International Studies, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Ramana garu, it's an honor to have you on the show, on our show today, and we at NRI Samay are really delighted. The timing
Thank you very much. The honor is really mine.
Thank you, Ramana garu, thank you. The timing of the show is really right as I perceive it. As a curiosity is at its high as far as nuclear power and its handling in India is concerned. And once again, thank you for your acceptance, taking time off to come to the show and help our listeners understand more about nuclear power and energy, Ramana garu.
Sure.
And I'm sure after the show today, listeners around the world would get a perspective of what nuclear energy is all about and why is it so important that the international community is all pondering on nuclear power and energy. What are the pros and cons of developing nuclear energy? What are the safety and security factors of nuclear reactors right now that are functional in India? How is that we are handling that? And what are the status of the recent bills that are passed in both houses of Parliament? And what is the status of that? I'll talk to Ramana garu more about all of these things. And Ramana garu, as you know, majority of people, even the educated crowd in India, are not fully knowledgeable about the latest happenings of nuclear energy and power is concerned. They feel it as a remote topic. So to start off, can you please enlighten our listeners around the world about how the nuclear power usage started in India and why was it started?
To start with, I think there's a good reason why people think of this as remote, to use the word that you used. And this is because typically nuclear power plants, nuclear reactors, are situated in remote areas, far away from big cities and so on, for reasons that should be fairly obvious given the recent history of the accident at Fukushima and having to having to make about 100,000 people evacuate from the near vicinity. But coming back to the question that you asked, which is that of the origin of nuclear power in India, it actually started fairly early. The first act to be passed in India was this bill that allowed for the creation of something called the Atomic Energy Commission. And this was passed in the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly was the body that existed before there was a formal Indian Parliament, just after India won independence from Great Britain in 1947. So the bill was actually introduced in 1948, and the head of the Constituent Assembly, who was to go on to become the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, introduced the bill saying that, basically arguing for why nuclear power was very important for the country. Now, Nehru, as many of you know, was a great believer in the power of science, and at that point, nuclear power had been had come on the world stage through the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and was seen as one of the greatest achievements of science at that point. Nehru, like many others, sort of abhorred the destructive potential to which this power had been put to, but there was a case that many scientists were making at that point, saying that the same energy can be utilized for peaceful purposes, basically to generate electricity. And the assumption then was that this electricity would be relatively cheap, and you would require large amounts of it in order for countries like India and also actually in the West to develop and have economic growth. Now, the context in which this was introduced was also interesting. What Nehru basically argued at the Constituent Assembly was that nuclear power represented something like the Industrial Revolution. And his argument was that in India, in the 18th and 19th centuries, India did not undergo the Industrial Revolution, and as a result, it had become what he called a slave state. Basically, it had been colonized. And he said that now nuclear power we have come upon the nuclear age, and if we are to remain abreast of the world, we must develop this atomic energy. And given the sort of context that India was just emerging from independence, or from colonialism, there was nobody practically who questioned the need, whether this was to be an important priority for a country that was just emerging from colonialism, which was undergoing this very traumatic partition, which had a whole bunch of other developmental challenges. So that's sort of where the origin of it was.
Okay.
But it took a long time between then and the first sort of generation of power. The first nuclear reactors to produce electricity were constructed in Tarapur in the state of Maharashtra, and this was between in the mid-1960s, and it came online in 1969. And since then, sort of India has been gradually building various nuclear power plants.
Okay, very nice. So you mentioned just now about the Fukushima meltdown, and this is a very important aspect of safety and security that I want to talk about. Engineers are still figuring out what went wrong at the Fukushima meltdown in Japan last year, and that's when the current generation, that means the young generation, have turned their heads, and then they're looking into what's going on with this nuclear power. So everyone knows nuclear power is extremely dangerous. In the backdrop of this Fukushima meltdown, and also for the benefit of our listeners, can you please talk about some of the nuclear disasters that happened in the past 2 to 3 decades, something like a Chernobyl nuclear disaster in Ukraine? Can you please explain our listeners?
Sure. So there have been a large number of accidents throughout the nuclear age, I'm not going to go through a whole list of them. But in terms of nuclear power plants, that is facilities that are used exclusively to generate electricity, there have been 3 large accidents. The first of these was not very far from where I live in Princeton. It's in a place called, it's in a reactor called 3 Mile Island, which is in the state of Pennsylvania. And this happened in 1979, where through some failures of certain components inside the nuclear power plant and operators not quite understanding what was happening, mainly because they had not been trained to understand, to think about these possibilities, the accident sort of expanded and there was a partial meltdown. What this means is that the what happens inside a nuclear power plant is that you have these fuel elements which are basically made of uranium and in some cases plutonium. Both uranium and plutonium are what we call fissile materials. They can undergo fission, which is to say that a heavy nucleus splits into 2 when being either by it spontaneously or when it is absorbs a neutron. And these neutrons, when it fissions, these uranium and plutonium also give off neutrons. And these neutrons can, in principle, go and hit another uranium nucleus or another plutonium nucleus. If this happens continuously, then this is what we call a chain reaction. This is the same physics that underlies both a nuclear explosion as well as a nuclear reactor. In the nuclear explosion case, what happens is that this process is uncontrolled, and the aim is to produce as much energy as possible in the shortest period of time. So that's what we call an explosion. In a nuclear reactor, on the other hand, this chain reaction is controlled so that the amount of power being produced is produced at a fairly constant rate, and then this the power is produced as heat basically, and this heat is then carried out away from the reactor by some kind of a coolant. The coolant that was used in 3 Mile Island was water, which is also the coolant that was used in Fukushima and also in Chernobyl. There are other reactors which have other coolants, and I won't talk about those. But the water basically takes away the heat that is being produced and is eventually converted into steam, and the steam goes to drive a steam turbine, which then generates electricity. Right? The problem is that if for some reason there is not adequate cooling, that is, the water is not flowing fast enough in order to remove all the heat that is being generated, the temperature of the fuel can go very high, can become higher and higher, because it's constantly generating fission reactions. It's constantly undergoing fission reactions, generating heat, and this heat has to go somewhere. If it doesn't go anywhere, it just goes on to heating the fuel elements. Right. In the case of 3 Mile Island, basically there was not enough cooling. The water level had fallen down to far greater extent than people had realized initially, and this meant that the fuel just got hotter and hotter and eventually melted. So you had what's called a partial meltdown. Now, so that was 1979. In 1986, there was an accident in Chernobyl, as you mentioned, in Ukraine, where it was a slightly different kind of a reactor and a different kind of a problem. But in that case, what happened was that the reaction went uncontrolled for reasons which have to do with the specifics of the design of the reactor, which I'm not going to go into. But that reaction went so fast that it basically exploded. And you could say it was a small nuclear explosion, much smaller than a nuclear weapon, but nevertheless there was this prompt criticality, as we call it in physics terms, that the reaction just went very fast, it was uncontrolled, and that basically blew open the reactor and expelled a huge amount of radioactivity into the atmosphere. And this then spread all over sort of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and large areas sort of received radioactive contamination. Now we come to Fukushima. In Fukushima, there was something slightly different happened. So, as you know, the accident started with the earthquake and the tsunami. We still don't know what actually the earthquake did to the reactor, whether some components were damaged, but certainly the major part of the accident started after the tsunami. And in Fukushima, what happened was that the earthquake, as soon as it occurred, the reactors actually shut down. In other words, in all these reactors, in order to control the rate at which power is generated, there are what are called control rods, which basically absorb neutrons. And once the control rods are inserted, they absorb most of the neutrons in such a way that a chain reaction is not possible. So this happened in Fukushima. But nevertheless, what is left of the inside the fuel rods is still undergoing radioactivity, still emitting heat. And because there was no electricity, there was no power to sort of drive water through the reactor, the heat that was being generated could not be carried out of the reactor. So that caused a meltdown there. And the other thing which happened was that when the fuel rods become very hot, the fuel rods are surrounded by an element called zirconium. And this zirconium starts interacting with water, which is present in all those places, in that area, in that volume, and generates hydrogen gas. And in Fukushima, this hydrogen gas, this happened, by the way, also in 3 Mile Island. So this is a very well-known and old problem which has just not been solvable for various reasons. And we can talk about why it's not been solved if you like later on. But this hydrogen gas is very explosive. In other words, it can combine with oxygen in the presence of anything that causes a fire, and it can basically explode. And this is what we saw on TV screens around the world in Fukushima in reactors 1 and 2.
Very well explained, and it's an excellent description of how this disaster happened. I think I've got a sense of what's going on there. And you're talking about explosion. As a layman, I have a very genuine question here. Let's imagine a nuclear reactor explodes. Can we compare it to a nuclear bomb?
Well, as I mentioned, in the case of Chernobyl, it is, the physics of it is not very different. What is basically happening is that there is a large amount of energy which is being generated over a very short period of time. Now, in the case of a nuclear weapon, the amount of energy that's being generated is thousands of times typically more than what happens in a nuclear reactor accident. It's comparable and not comparable. It is not going to be anywhere as destructive in terms of sort of shock effects and fire and so on, the kinds of really destructive impacts that effects which occur because of a nuclear weapon explosion. So in that sense, they are not comparable. But in terms of what is happening underlying it, it is possible. Now, in the Fukushima case, to the extent that we know, there was no nuclear explosion. There was only a hydrogen explosion, which is a chemical process. And this is something which can happen in any chemical factory which uses hydrogen, or we have seen explosions in various other kinds of chemical plants.
Right.
And so, explosions are explosions. So explosions, in some sense, for a physicist, means a large amount of energy produced over a very short period of time. So in that sense, they are all, there's some comparability. But the underlying mechanisms that cause this energy are often different, and the effects can be quite different.
Okay. So all these nuclear power plants are equipped with safety measures, backup plans. Despite this, why are the consequences so severe, and how long-lasting were they, or are they, if we talk in both the terms? So why are these consequences so severe, and how long-lasting would this be?
Okay, so you have two questions there. Why are there accidents, in a sense, despite safety measures, and what are the how long-lasting are the consequences? So let me answer the consequences part first.
Sure.
Well, there are sort of fairly well-documented effects of exposure to radiation, right? And so let me back up and say the primary impact that one is looking for, or one that occurs in the event of a nuclear reactor accident, typically, is that a large amount of radioactive substances are expelled into the atmosphere through one route or into the biosphere, maybe sometimes through water, and it basically spreads around and exposes people to radiation. And the radiation can affect you. There are sort of two kinds of ways by which the radiation can enter your body. The first is external. So there's some, as some of you might know, there are three kinds of ionizing radiation that we talk about: alpha rays, beta rays, and gamma rays. Alpha particles are basically helium nuclei which don't have electrons, so they are highly charged, they're heavy. And beta particles are basically fast-moving electrons. Now, both of these typically do not enter your body. The beta rays are stopped by the skin layer, and alpha particles do not even enter much of the skin. So both of them can affect your body only if you somehow inhale a substance, or you drink something, or there's a cut in your body through which some of these radioactive particles enter your body. Once they go inside your body, then these things can basically affect your DNA, and I'll come to that in a second. Gamma rays, on the other hand, can actually, if they are sufficiently energetic, even if the source of the gamma rays is outside your body, it can actually give you a radiation dose because it can enter your body. Now, in the case of most of these reactor accidents, the two radionuclides we are most concerned about in terms of short to medium term effects are what are called iodine-131. This is a radioactive, short-lived isotope of normal iodine, which is a substance that we sort of hear about in common life too. This is something which has to go inside your body. A typical route through which it goes inside your body is that it's deposited on grass and other things which cows or goat and so on eat, and then the milk that they generate, that they give out, if that's drunk, then that's something that can go inside. You can also breathe in iodine because of the as the cloud of radioactivity goes over you, as you breathe in whatever iodine is inside the cloud sort of goes inside your body. So these are ways by which iodine can contaminate. The other material that's of concern is what's called cesium-137. And cesium is a gamma ray emitter, and cesium is something which, in the case of sort of Chernobyl, for example, there are about 10,000 square kilometers of it which are still contaminated with this. So the ground around that area, the plants and so on, are contaminated with cesium-137. And if you're just even walking in that area, let's say you're a farmer or whatever, you are exposed to this constant outside radiation. So these are the two primary things. The iodine is a very short-lived thing, as I mentioned. It has a half-life of only about 8.5 days. So that's not something which is a is not a long-lived contaminant. Cesium-137, on the other hand, has a radioactive half-life of about 30 years. And usually what we say is that it takes about 10 half-lives for the contamination to reduce by about 1,000th of it. So you can imagine that the cesium-137 contamination can last up to 300 years before the radioactive dose comes down. Now, in practical things, there are other things which are happening. For example, you have dust which is falling on top of it and so on. So it may not actually take 300 years, but certainly it takes decades before that particular area can be considered decontaminated sufficiently for people to inhabit.
Right.
Now, so that's about, and okay, so what happens when you are exposed to radiation? The primary impact that we talk about is cancer. There are essentially these ionizing radiation. What it does is that it can break one or two strands of your DNA in your cells, and usually the cell repair mechanisms can repair it, but every now and then they make a mistake, and that's something which leads to cancer. Now,
Wow.
there is evidence for a whole range of other impacts from radiation. Some of it is controversial, some of it is relatively well documented, but at fairly low levels, and that's a whole big can of worms they don't want to sort of go into. But as I said, the primary thing that we are talking about is cancer. And even when it comes to cancer, there is a huge amount of uncertainty and great amount of scientific debate over how big the impact is, how many cancers will develop in a population if they are exposed to a certain amount of radiation. The problem is that this impact is what we call stochastic. In other words, if you have 100 people exposed to the same amount of radiation, some fraction of them, maybe, depending on the level of radiation, let's say 10 people are going to be exposed. But you cannot predict which 10 people are going to be exposed. So it's not something which is deterministic. So you cannot say, look, I'm sitting next to a radiation source, nothing has happened to me, therefore nothing will happen to you. That's not going to be true. Whether the impact depends on sort of individual factors or it is just the nature of the how cancer proceeds, that it is stochastic, is something which is still people are trying to understand. Okay? So in the case of Chernobyl, for example, estimates of how many cancers were caused by that accident range from a few thousands, let's say about 4,000, to maybe up to 1 million. Now, I think both the extremes are kind of improbable. My own estimates are, it should be probably the order of 30 to 40,000 cancers occurring over a period of several decades, and over a background of maybe, millions of cancers which develop due to other causes. I mean, cancer is something which happens not only when you are exposed to radiation, but because of a whole bunch of other things, natural causes, exposure to other carcinogens, things in your diet, and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to tell apart which cancer came from a nuclear exposure and which came from natural or other causes. So that's one reason why it's very, very controversial.
I got it.
So the long explanation to your fairly short question.
Yes, but very nice usage of words. You mentioned about cancers and with consequences so severe. I have to come to this question straight. How safe is India's nuclear energy program? This is a fair question. So could you explain how safe is India's nuclear energy program?
Okay. Again, this is a as you must have seen, I don't give very simple answers. I'm going to sort of hedge my answer in many ways. I would say there are two things to sort of think about. The first is that there are the way we think about how safety is implemented. It depends on certain technological features. So you build in various safety systems. For example, we've all seen these big containment domes, which are basically large concrete or metal structures which are built around nuclear power plants that are meant to hold the power, the energy that's left out. And then there are sort of various things within the nuclear power plant itself. And then there are what one might call sort of organizational or safety culture, the way people approach how safely a facility is operated. Now, I've looked at great detail into how the Indian nuclear establishment has operated its facilities, and I would say that they've made very many choices which are not good for safety on the whole. So if you look at some of the previous accidents that have happened, and you ask the question, could this accident have been prevented? Why did this happen? What choices were made in order for the necessary conditions for this accident to develop be present? The answer is that they have often compromised safety for other considerations, either because they don't think an accident is possible and so they don't have to protect against it, or because there are sort of economic and other priorities. So you want to build a plant more cheaply, so you sort of skimp on how strong the containment is. Because the stronger the containment, the more concrete and steel and so on have to be used. Engineering design often is a matter of trying to optimize different priorities, but some places stress safety more at the cost of other things. Other places stress, trying to build it more cheaply in the sort of hope that, in some kind of absurd confidence that accidents will not occur. And on this spectrum, my general sense is that the Indian nuclear establishment has erred on the side of trying to, of being too confident that accidents are not going to happen, which is why you see quite often statements by heads of the Atomic Energy Commission and so on saying an accident is just not possible, right? They're 100% confident that an accident is not going to happen, things of the sort, which is for a scientist makes absolutely no sense, right? You can say the probability is low, it's 1 in a million, 1 in a billion, whatever it is, but you can't say it is 0. But these statements, I think, have at their root a kind of confidence that their reactors are so safe that accidents are not possible. And this, I think, is actually a very, the sentiment itself is very detrimental to safety. Right? These, what safety theorists around the world have sort of realized is that these things are so hazardous that one has to be always worried about the possibility of an accident, always have to be trying to maintain the best possible safety. And if you're confident that it is not going to happen, then you will not be doing that.
Right. Right. We have right now a caller, Srihari from Los Angeles. Sure. Srihari Garu, if you're on air, go ahead and ask M V Ramana Garu question.
Ramana Garu, namaste and good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming on the show and explaining us the problems with the nuclear power. But I have a different side of the coin. Suppose, suppose if we take comparison of India and China, China has picked up the industrial revolution of late 2000s pretty fast. India is obviously they produce a lot of production they have, and there is no comparison at all. So I believe that if we have more electricity, then and our industries have more electricity, then we can produce. Suppose if they get like 10 or 12 hours of power now, what if they get like 16 or 20 hours of power? And how much more they can produce. Similarly, our farmers get power of 8 or maybe 6 hours, which is also unreliable power. What if they get 15 or 16 hours power? So the power obviously is directly related to the development of the country and how we compete with big countries, emerging countries like China, which is China is breathing down our neck. We know that around the borders. In this context, don't you think that nuclear power is a necessity for in India right now? Obviously, there are other forms of power that we could use, but this seems to be the quickest way to compete with the world and also to support our food sectors.
Sure. So I'll break up your question into two parts. First is, the question of should we have more power on the whole and so on. And the second is your statement that nuclear power seems to be the quickest way to compete, to generate this power and compete. So the second part first is probably more important, which is that if you think about what does it mean to say it's going to be the quickest, right? So to answer that, you have to look at what the record of nuclear power in the country has been. Now, for years and years, for decades, we've seen the Atomic Energy Commission put out projections of how fast they can build up nuclear power, right? So in the late 1950s and early 1960s, they were talking about 8,000 megawatts of nuclear power by 1980, right? And by 1970s, they were talking about, the first thing I have to say is that when they were making these projections in the late 1950s and 1960s, there was not a single watt of nuclear electricity that had been produced in the country, right? So this was just projections based on some complete paper studies. As the first reactors were being built in 1969, they came out with an even more ambitious projection, which is that by the year 2000, India would have 43,500 megawatts of nuclear electricity capacity. Now, if you look at the actual record, in 2000, the total nuclear capacity installed was about 2,000 megawatts. So about 5% of what was actually projected, right? And you can see sort of subsequent projections again sort of failing, and I don't want to sort of go into this whole litany. But the basic issue is that to try and assume that nuclear reactors can be set up very fast is, I think, a basic fallacy, right? So this is not going to be a quick process, regardless of whether you think it's going to be desirable or not, right? So that's the first thing to remember. The second is, if you look at the current projections, they're even worse in some ways, because most of these projections, which they're talking about, increasing 100-fold over the next 40 years, are based on a technology, a particular kind of nuclear technology called breeder reactor technology. And breeders have been shown around the world to be very expensive, having a lot of minor, small accidents, which sort of makes the operation of it difficult, unreliable, and subject to frequent shutdowns. And there are, problems with the way they've done their calculations. I'm sort of not going to go into that, but it makes it even less likely that these future projections are going to be actually delivered, right? Now let's come back to the first question. Should we have more electricity and so on? I think the answer is probably yes. An answer is yes, but you have to ask the question: how do we decide on what kind of electricity we should generate, what kind of thing, and how much of it should we be generating? And as a physicist, I would say you would have to specify what the boundary conditions are. In other words, you have to tell me what are the constraints that you're going to apply in order to decide how much of this how much electricity should generate, what kind of electricity generate, where do we generate it, and so on. So if you, for example, say, I want the cheapest source of power, I don't care about anything else, right? Then the answer would be actually coal, right? It happens to be relatively plentiful in India, certainly around the world. It happens to be, at this point, one of the cheapest sources of generating electricity. It has huge problems, both with sort of climate change things, which is sort of best known here, but also with local pollution issues, with issues to do with mining, and so on. So those are real costs in some sense that somebody is going to be paying for, right? You can tell me that, I don't want, climate change effects, or I don't want coal for various reasons. And then you would ask the question, what about natural gas? What about renewables? What about nuclear power? Each of them has negative points, right? And we have to, these are not, I think, decisions that you and I, or some small set of people should be making. This should be a democratic decision, because the impacts of this, as you see in the case of Fukushima, there are a small number of people who are deeply affected, right, whose lives have been changed forever, just because they happen to have lived in that region near Fukushima reactors. Those people, what is their stake in this thing, and how are they going to be affecting the decision process? And this is what we see in the case of, in India, for example, near the Koodankulam Nuclear Power Plants, which are being constructed in Tirunelveli district in Tamil Nadu, where for the last several months there has been a huge protest by local people who say we do not want this facility, right? And they have actually been protesting this plant ever since the late 1980s, when the plans first started, all right? Now, what are we going to say to them? Are you going to say, well, tough luck, you guys have to live near this risky facility. Too bad for you, right? And so these are not, I think, decisions that, you and I can make. It should be something which is democratically decided. We don't have the mechanisms at this point to actually go through that. And we've not gone through that social dialogue. So you can't just say, oh, nuclear power is the way to do this.
I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
Okay, so in case of the nuclear power in Tamil Nadu, suppose, common people, they don't know all the details. There is a possibility, like you said, the possibility could be 1 in a million or 1 in a billion. So I think they are, even rest of the India, they rely on what the expert says. So in this case, maybe Abdul Kalam is not an expert, but he is definitely a trustworthy person, probably one of the most. So he is saying that we don't need to worry too much about the implications of it, and he is a proponent of this nuclear power plant. So where is the gap?
Well, I think the gap is I don't know whether I want to call it a gap. Or let me put it this way: there is a gap clearly. There are a few people who think that this technology is safe. The majority of people around the world think that nuclear power is unsafe. Right? Now, you might try to, one might try to think that this is a difference between quote-unquote experts and common people. That's true to some extent, but I think there are two problems there. The first is if you ask an expert, right, what is the relevant metric to try and decide whether something is safe or not, he or she might offer one of these statistics, periods of, number of deaths per kilowatt hour produced, or a number of accidents per year, or something like that. Now, these numbers by themselves do not mean very much. They depend on the social context in which you are trying to evaluate it. Let me give you a very simple example, which has nothing to do with nuclear power. All right. If you think about coal production, right? In the UK, for example, they found that between the 1950s and the 1980s, if you look at the number of accidents that happened, the number of fatalities that happened to coal miners in these plants, between the 1950s and 1980s, if you look at the number of accidents per ton of coal produced, it actually decreased, right? So this would make you think that the coal plants are safer, right? But on the other hand, if you look at the number of accidents per miner employed, that actually increased per miner per year, right? Why was this the case? Essentially, what happened was productivity during those years went up dramatically. The number of people who were employed went down. The amount of coal that was being produced went up, right? So the same number of deaths could be portrayed in completely different ways, and it means very different things. For the owner of the coal plant, the first statistic is what is important, because the amount of coal produced determines the profit that he or she makes, and the amount of number of deaths is the amount of compensation he or she has to pay out. So that's the cost to him. The first is a benefit, and that statistic is more important. If you are going to be a miner, then it is the second statistic which is important. You don't care how much coal the plant produces. What you care about is what is the risk of you yourself having an accident, right? So numbers by themselves don't mean a lot. They depend very much on the context in which you place it. The second point is that when you look at something like the number of deaths, right? People, if you ask them what is risk, right? I can turn this question around and ask you, what do you think is risk? And if you did that same question with a large number of people, they would basically say risk has to do with a large number of characteristics, right? It has to do with the frequency of accidents and number of deaths, but it also has to do with how many deaths happen at one point. It depends on whether you think these accidents result in consequences that are very long-lived, that might affect, let's say, my children and my grandchildren and future generations. That's very different from having, let's say, a car accident where somebody dies at that instant, right? So people evaluate risk using a very multidimensional perspective on the whole, right? And I think that that's actually that's completely legitimate. There's no reason why you should say only by numbers of deaths per whatever metric you use is the way we should be thinking about risk, right? So this is, I think, a basic problem here. Right? So this gap, as you put it, is something which has its basis in the way people perceive risk, and I don't think that's going to go away. Right? It's not something where you can go and tell them, oh, you have to think about it in this fashion and look at it in terms of numbers of deaths, and that's the only statistic which is important. I think that's just technocratic elitism to try and think that, people who are experts, quote-unquote experts, have the right to dictate to other people how they should be thinking about these things. That's number one. Second, when you come to the question of experts in India and so on, I think there is a huge problem. I mean, people like Kalam, with all due respect to him, cannot be considered to be some kind of a neutral person who can come out there and say something and be trusted, right? The people in Koodankulam basically, in the region clearly said, look, we don't trust you, right? We see a more recent example now. The Tamil Nadu state government has just appointed a quote-unquote expert committee. One of the people they have put in that expert committee is a former chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, M.R. Srinivasan, right? Clearly, he or she is not going to have to go to look at what the Koodankulam plant is like, what the local specifics are. He or she is going to say this plant is safe. I can give you that in writing even before the committee starts its work, right? At this point, how can you expect people to trust what this committee is saying? It's a clearly political decision when you set up something of the sort, right? So there is no process by which people can actually try to trust these kind of experts.
Right. Fantastically put in, Ramana garu. It's really good. Thank you, Sri garu, for that nice question and as well as a follow-up. And coming back, talking about your work you did on nuclear energy and the online research and the work that you have done, Ramana garu, and the sort of gives me an impression that you're a strong opponent of nuclear energy. Is that a fair statement to make?
No, yes and no. Okay, so I'll explain. The yes is, it's something which seems very obvious. So I'm not going to go into that. But let me say why the no is. On nuclear weapons, I have a clear moral position against it. All right. So it's a question of saying, I think it is not correct to kill millions of people in this sort of brutal fashion. And I don't think there is going to be much debate about that. There has been some debate, but let's not go into that. On the question of nuclear energy, on the other hand, I think it's very much a question of trying to think about what the benefits are and what the costs are, right? And so if you, if you think that the costs outweigh the benefits, you're going to say, here are the costs, and I don't see the benefits as being proportional to this. So I think the simple problem is that there are many ways of generating electricity. Nuclear power just happens to be one way, right? And so because there are these alternatives, you can say, look, I'm perfectly for, to go back to the earlier question, I'm perfectly for development, I'm perfectly for generating more amount of electricity, but I beg to differ about what the best choice of this technology for that is. Right? It's so I would not like to be called sort of against nuclear power or in a strong opponent of nuclear power. It's sort of like when I make a decision about whether I want to buy a house or not, whether I want to buy a second car or not, I look at some of these things and I say, look, I think this is not okay. And that does not mean that I'm anti-car or anti-buying houses.
Right. Very good. So you're mentioning about alternate power. A lot of people say that alternate powers that we are talking about, no matter what kind of alternate power we talk about, they're not reliable or predictable. But then nuclear power is very reliable. You know that you can generate this amount of power, this amount of energy is generated. So do you think this alternate power that we are talking about is unpredictable, unreliable?
By itself, there are two. This is a well-known problem in a sense. I mean, we all know that the sun doesn't shine at all times, so you can't be generating solar power in the night. The wind doesn't blow at all times. So this is a sort of well-known problem. But I think that people have been plugging away at this for decades now, and we've found lots of ways by which you can make it much more reliable. Right? there are sort of two simple things to think about. One is that you have diversity. So you have both geographical diversity as well as technological diversity. So for example, if you have a mixture of both solar energy and wind power, then clearly, when this wind typically blows much more in the night, the sun shines in the day, so there is some complementarity there. The second is geographical diversity. The wind may not be blowing right now in New Jersey, but it may be blowing in Pennsylvania, it may be blowing in other parts of the country, and if you sort of link up those things, those separate generation stations, you can make it much more reliable. But the second and more important thing is it's clear to everybody that if you have to have a grid that is much more dependent on renewable sources of energy, then you have to have some amount of storage. And there again, there has been dramatic improvement over the several decades. The oldest form of sort of storage has been what's called pumped hydro, that you have basically kind of a dam where the water is pumped up when the demand is low and the generation is high, and then when you require more power than the generators are producing at any given time, you let the water flow back down. And other ways through compressed air storage. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in that realm also. So I don't think that it's a fundamental problem. It's a problem that can be addressed, and we see that to a large extent. For example, there are places in Europe where renewable electricity has made substantial inroads. There is a fairly large fraction of electricity generation that happens in countries like Denmark and Germany from renewables. So I don't think it's a fundamental problem.
Okay, very good. And you also mentioned in your earlier discussion about the cost that we incur in generating this nuclear power. Seems like we are in a rush to build the reactors in Chennai and other places. So in terms of budget, on whatever clarity we have got, in terms of budget, what are the costs incurred in generating in creating the new nuclear reactors, and how would it impact our economy?
So the costs that let me take one concrete example. All right. So there's a 500 megawatt reactor that's being built near Chennai in this place called Kalpakkam, and this is what's called a breeder reactor. This is called the prototype fast breeder reactor. So this was originally envisioned to cost about 3,500 crores, just the building of the reactor. Wow. It's now gone through a couple of cost revisions, and now the revised cost is about 5,600 crores, which is 56 billion rupees. So that gives you a sort of sense of the magnitude of this. Now, there's also a whole bunch of other facilities and which are required in order to deal with the fuel, to produce it, to reprocess it, to eventually dispose of the waste and so on. Those all sort of add to this. No, but I think by itself, these things don't mean much. You have to do a comparison. So if you look at just, I've looked at the kind of reactors that have been built in the past, what are called heavy water reactors, and you compare them with coal plants, which just happens to be the most common source of electricity generation in India. And you find that typically nuclear power is, depending on what you assume to be the various financial and other parameters that you should be using for evaluating the economics, it turns to be 10 to 25% more expensive compared to coal. And in terms of what it's going to affect the whole economy, that's a harder question because that depends on how large of a nuclear sector you're building. And trying to understand how the price of electricity determines the economy is also something which is a complicated thing. Depends on the nature of the economy, how it's going to develop, and so on. So I would rather not give a clear answer to that.
Right, but clearly you've mentioned the magnitude of the cost that we incur in building the nuclear reactors. It seems to be way, way beyond imagination of billions of dollars being poured into create this nuclear reactors. So that gives us a sense of how expensive it is, and we never know what's the return on that investment. So yeah, very, very nice way to put in.
Yeah.
Yes, and You've also in the earlier question mentioned about the protests that we have got when people are protesting against the Jaitapur nuclear power project in Maharashtra, and then the Koodankulam nuclear power project. And my question is, what are the primary concerns, and do you think the government is addressing them in the right terms? Of course, you have mentioned it earlier, but still, to give in a better clarity, do you think we are incorporating the lessons learned from Fukushima and then addressing the concerns, and do you think the government is in the right direction in that front?
So the first thing to say is that in India, since the 1980s, every reactor site that has been chosen, every nuclear facility, new nuclear facility site that has been chosen, has been opposed by local people. Right? This has been sort of across the board. Only in a couple of cases have these protests been successful. In particular, both of these were in the state of Kerala in the 1980s and early 1990s, where a proposed nuclear power plant was cancelled on account of protests. The same may be happening in West Bengal. We are still not clear in the state of Haripur, when Mamata Banerjee became the chief minister. She promised that this project will be abandoned. So that may be another case where this may happen. All right. Now coming back to the question, what is driving these protests? There are two sentiments which are driving. One is, what we're all familiar with in terms of nuclear risk, which is people are concerned about accidents. And, I think the example of the protests over Koodankulam is evidence of that, because the protests, which have, as I said, have been there since the project was proposed in the late 1980s, really picked up steam after the Fukushima accident, right? So after Fukushima, people could see for themselves, right, that what these people, some of the people who are opposing it were talking was not abstract. It's something which can happen. And if it can happen in a country like Japan, which is clearly seen as a very advanced country with much more experience in nuclear power than India and other things, it is a very concrete illustration for them. So I think that's very, very true. The second is that, I know you're running out of time, so let me just say one more thing, which is that the protests are also guided by concerns about livelihoods, concerns about water being diverted, land being taken away. And this sentiment is sort of common to a large number of other projects. This protests over dams, protests over the nano plant, the nano car plant, and so on and so forth. And I don't think the government really has addressed it. The way the government tries to address it is basically saying your concerns don't have any basis. They set up these expert committees to come and tell them why the plant is completely safe, why we will be creating employment for you, and so on and so forth. I think people around the country have seen that these promises mean nothing, and this is why I think we see these protests growing, and I think they will grow even further in the future.
Right. And just to take your opinion here, we wanted to extend it for another 5-10 minutes. Is that okay with you, Dr. Ramana?
Sure.
Yeah, it's really going good, and then it's a fantastic discussion we're having on the nuclear power. I think it's one of its kind of show where I think a lot of listeners are getting a real perspective in layman terms on how nuclear power is created and what's the impact and consequences and how good we are in India. So I think if you're okay with it, we'll go for another 5-10 minutes here.
Certainly.
Yeah, you've mentioned as well about global warming, and as we know, 68% of electricity in our country is scattered by burning coal. Now, a lot of these experts claim that this burning coal and these fossil fuels are causing this global warming and health hazards. So, nuclear power is got the right way to fight this global warming. What do you think about all this? Is this a fair statement to make that nuclear power, if you have, will control the global warming, will control the pollution in India, so or anywhere in the world? Do you think it's a fair statement to make?
From a physics point of view, from a completely science point of view, nuclear power produces relatively low amounts of greenhouse gases. Right? A reactor itself does not burn anything, so it cannot, except for maybe some small amount of oil in the turbines or something. I don't know. But by and large, it's pretty much zero carbon, but there's a huge amount of, because our whole infrastructure is so fossil fuel based, the production of the concrete, the steel, the mining of the uranium, and so on, all of them take some amount of fossil fuels, and therefore it does have some impact on greenhouse gas emissions. But having said that, it has to be admitted that it's going to be much smaller compared to a coal plant, obviously, right? There are a whole range of estimates, but typically they are of the order of a few percent of what a coal plant generates throughout its life cycle. So in that sense, it is possible. But I think we have to go back and ask a couple of questions. The first is to say, if you look at if you're talking about India itself, the question to ask is, are we talking about nuclear power instead of coal, right? That's the time when you can make this comparison, that you're going to actually stop building coal plants and build only nuclear power plants. Then you can say, okay, maybe this is going to be a solution to India's emission problem. But clearly that's not the case. What is being promised in all the government reports and so on is coal plus nuclear power, right? So coal is expected to grow by a factor of 10 over the next 40 years. Nuclear power, just because it's so small, they talk about it going by a factor of 100, right? But then even at the end of it, they're going to be more or less comparable at best, right? So that's number one. The second thing to ask is, if you look at India's sort of negotiating stance on the question of climate change, right? The position India has been basically making is that these emissions, India is a developing country, we do not want to take caps on our emissions, right? So if that's the case, you're not thinking about limiting your emissions, then when you suddenly say, oh, nuclear power is good because it's sort of reducing emissions, there is a clear discrepancy there, right? It seems to be a very opportunistic sort of notion of this, opportunistic use of the fact that nuclear power is low carbon. Then finally, and I think most fundamentally, we have to ask this question, what does it take to solve climate change, right? And this, I think, is the hardest problem in a sense, because it has a lot also to do with the notion that we have to have economies around the world that continue to grow, that continue to use resources, not just in terms of carbon emissions, but also in terms of how much materials we use, how much water we use, and so on, which is clearly unsustainable, right? So until that basic paradigm, in a sense, is sort of challenged and sort of rethought, I don't know whether you can really talk about any solution to climate change, right? These are all sort of, shuffling chairs on the Titanic, in a sense, as the metaphor goes, while actually the whole planet is sort of heading towards a major crisis.
Very well said, very well said. And this is one question I wanted to ask you. We have around 20 reactors right now in our country. And as well, India was hit by tsunami in 2006, early 2005, 2006. So I was wondering, do you think of anything that comes in your mind real quick that you think this reactor needs to be shut down? Geographically, it's not very safe to have this reactor at this place in our country. So do you have anything in our mind that you feel like it needs an immediate attention and needs to be shut down?
I mean, I think there are certainly, I would say some reactors are in locations which are worse, but this actually presumes something which I'm not quite comfortable with. The presumption, I mean, the way, and you also asked me a question earlier, have the lessons of Fukushima been learned? And I'd like to sort of address that also in this context. And I think the problem, if you think about safety in general, what has been the case is that people typically look at an accident and they assume that the next accident, major accident, is going to happen in a similar fashion and try to fight it, right? But in fact, each of the major accidents we've seen in the nuclear field have been very different accidents, right? So 3 Mile Island was not similar at all to Chernobyl. In fact, when 3 Mile Island happened and in the subsequent years, the Soviet nuclear engineers and scientists we're constantly saying, oh, this kind of an accident that's happened in 3 Mile Island can never happen in our reactors. And they were right, because their reactors were designed in a very different fashion, right? So the problems that came up in 3 Mile Island would not happen there, right? And likewise, when Chernobyl happened, everybody was sort of saying, this cannot happen in our country because our reactors are different, right? So there's a problem. The problem is that accidents can happen through multiple pathways, right? So to try and assume that, it's only through a tsunami that the next accident is going to happen is, I think, being completely myopic, right? So by sort of making up these kind of lists of saying, here are the reactors which I think are going to be most susceptible to an earthquake or a tsunami, I might be missing out on other pathways, right? And I think this has been the case. So in that sense, I'm sort of uncomfortable with trying to make up these lists and saying, this reactor has to be shut. The implication of that being that other reactors are somehow immune to accidents.
Right. That's correct. Very well said. And coming to another important point of the Nuclear Liability Bill that came up in fag end of 2010, and eventually this bill being introduced in upper houses of India, it's become a lot of controversial bill. It talks more about privatization and giving control to private parties. So, and also you've when we advertised this show, you've brought up a very nice quote saying profit is privatized and risk is socialized. So can we tie these two things and then talk about how this privatization will have an impact on the nuclear sector?
Yeah, I think that so the Nuclear Liability Bill comes in the context of what happened, the India trying to import reactors from other countries, primarily the United States, Russia, and France. So the liability question goes back to a long time ago. So there were sort of two pressures that built upon this. The first is that if you think about the operator of a nuclear power plant, right? In the United States, most of these were private companies, private utilities. And for them, if they are going to be liable for an accident, then essentially they are talking about possibly huge amounts of money to be paid out in the event of an accident, albeit a fairly low frequency event, right? And so what they try to do is, in a typical fashion, they went out and tried to get insurance for these things. And the insurance companies basically said, no way we're going to do this, because we know that if you're planning for catastrophic incidents, then, of insurance, then you have to be prepared to pay these huge amounts, and we are not. We'll all go bust, right? So the government actually had to step in and limit the liability, and they said they introduced something called a Price-Anderson Act, which said this is the amount of liability that a private company or anybody who is operating the plant is going to have to spend, right? In case of an accident. Above that, the government is taking over. Basically, the victims get nothing, right? Now, in India and so on, that never came up because it was a government-run operation, right? The second motivation came when the U.S. was trying to export nuclear reactors in the 1960s and 70s to Western Europe and other countries. And there the concern was, let's say Westinghouse is selling a nuclear power plant to to France or something, and there's an accident there. Can a victim from France sue Westinghouse for saying your reactor was badly designed or had a flaw, and that's why this accident happened, and this is why I'm suffering, so you have to pay for me, right? And so they really didn't want to deal with that. So they basically said, if you're going to import a reactor from us, you have to sign an agreement which says that all the liability will rest with the operator of the plant, right? So think of it like this. It's like last year we had this, a couple of years back, there was this case of Toyota cars in this country having this sort of stuck pedal case, right? So now imagine that, Toyota was behaving exactly like a nuclear operator, nuclear vendor, right? So if, let's say there's a stuck pedal Toyota which is driving on the road, which has a sudden case of stuck pedal, and comes and hits me, all right? And, my leg is broken or something. Now, according to this, I can only sue the operator of the car, which is the driver, right? Now, the driver is going to turn around and say, this is a problem with Toyota. It's not my problem. I didn't do anything here. But I will be waiving my rights to be able to get any compensation from Toyota for this. Right? So it's exactly that's the equivalent here. So now so basically the risk is something which is transferred to either the individual or to the government, right? So if maybe in the case of a nuclear disaster like in Fukushima, it's the government of Japan is picking up the tab essentially, right? TEPCO has essentially gone bankrupt. And so beyond a certain point, the private, so in India, at the moment, it is still all government-operated nuclear power plants, but they are certainly thinking about, Reliance and Tata and so on, trying to come into this business. So they are interested in. They're not concerned about whether the liability goes to the supplier or not. They are concerned about whether the liability is capped at a certain amount or not, right? The vendors are concerned about whether the liability actually transfers back to them or not. And this was a big debate, and in some sense, what we've got is that the bill does allow vendors to be sued in case of the operator can claim redress from the supplier if there is a problem has been shown to be one with the reactor design. And so this is something which is fairly unique in the world, and resulted primarily because there was a lot of grassroots and political pressure from people.
Okay. Okay. So all the discussion that we had just now regarding this private vendors dealing with this nuclear power, there's no concept of public or people's version being taken in the whole thing. Oh, that's not fair enough. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, I think and again you have to look at it in the specific context of India, where in the case of Bhopal, what happened was that the government said we are going to sort of negotiate on behalf of the victims, and they ended up with this sort of fairly paltry settlement of $470 million, which was really inadequate to deal with the victims of the Bhopal disaster, right? And so there is not a great deal of trust. And given that the Manmohan Singh government, for example, has been sort of bending backwards in order to please these nuclear vendors, it's not likely that they're going to really sue them for all that they can, they ought to be liable for.
Right.
Which is why people are sort of saying, even the people who are the victims ought to have a right to sort of do something about it, and they should not be sort of signing themselves out of this loop. But that has not happened.
Exactly. And just to, in the wrapping terms, what's the way forward in terms of energy security, Dr. Ramana? What do you think is the way forward?
I think two things. I think that I'm not sure what exactly we should be thinking about in terms of energy security, right? It's sort of like saying, we don't all live in sort of islands. We trade lots of other things, and I think energy is also one of those things. And so I think that notions of energy security are sort of difficult for me to understand. But having said that, I think in the conventional way in which it is being thought about, which is that our sources of energy have to come sort of domestically, where we have control over these things, I think that this is something which has to devolve far lower down. It should not be thought about just in national terms, but in fairly local terms. And if we do that, then I think the only way we can think about it is to sort of have very much more local level planning and control over how energy is generated and used in a local level. And I think that it would naturally lead us to sort of have a much larger renewable sector than we have right now. And I think that there is, vast scope for that. But I think that primarily one should be thinking about this as a process question rather than a product question. It's not so much that you should say, here is the right mixture of technologies that should determine what when we are energy secure, but how do common people get to decide how this energy infrastructure is being set up, who bears the cost, who gets the benefits, and things of that sort. And so I think that's where the focus really should be. And that's not something which is easy to sort of sit in a distance and try to solve. It's something which has to be worked through the political process.
Right. And one last and final question that I would like to ask Dr. Ramana. There's one side, there's public outrage, aversion towards nuclear power, and the other side, political politics coming into play and then pushing for this nuclear power, bringing in, exporting the nuclear reactor technologies and talking about various different things. So one side the public and the one side the government's trying to push in. So I was trying to understand, all anybody could do is bring in awareness, and there might be some NGOs or non-government agencies which will be helping to bring in awareness and how to avert it, or how to mitigate these risks, or how to escape from all these kinds of disasters. So do you know upfront in your mind, do you know some organizations or NGOs who are working on those lines, helping bring awareness about the nuclear programs and how people can be well informed about all these kinds of risks?
I think that there are very few NGOs or things which have been, which are sort of thinking about them as NGOs. There are, I think, a large number of protest organizations. So, like in the Koodankulam area, there is something called PMAIN, which is People's Movement Against Nuclear Energy, and so they've been doing a lot of work in that region, and there are sort of similar groups around the country. So they are, certainly places where one can go to try and, I mean, they do their thing, but they have primarily a local focus. Then there are, I think there used to be a group called Anumukti, which is based in Vedchi in Gujarat. And the people who used to run it are now a little older, so they are not sort of as active anymore. But they are still there. But I think the best place to go to is there is a relatively new resource called dianuke.org, dianuke.org, which is a kind of a web-based forum for discussions on these kinds of things. It's called Dialogue and Resources on Nuclear Nature and Society. That could be a good place for people to go to sort of get a little bit of information perspective, and a lot of things get posted there from around the world. So,
very good piece of information, Ramana Garu. It's a great honor to have you on our show today. And once again, we at NRI Samay and all our listeners around the world, I'm sure, are extremely delighted to have you on our show and then listen to all the perspectives about nuclear energy, pros and cons, safety, security, and recent bills. You've covered almost every aspect of nuclear power, and this is a comprehensive discussion about the impact of nuclear power and how it basically is running back in our country as well, in India. So thank you very much, Dr. Ramana.
You're very welcome. The honor was really mine, and I thank you for an excellent set of questions and leading an excellent discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramana Garu. Thank you, Ramana Garu. Listeners around the world, wherever you are, as you have heard to Dr. M V Ramana Garu, who's brought in all the perspectives regarding nuclear energy. And thank you very much, folks around the world. And this is NRI Samay, live from Los Angeles. And to bring you about the next upcoming shows, the next week we have Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan, the Lok Satta Andolan movement and the Lok Satta party president, who's working on the farmers' issues. And he's saying that he would defy the rules and then export paddy to Karnataka, wherein the price is much higher than what we have in Andhra Pradesh. So he says there's no other way out. He has written in numerous letters to the government. He has brought in awareness. He has requested the government multiple times, saying that this is unfair, that the farmers are committing suicide, and it's time we bring in our thoughts and then allow them to export the paddy and then the crop to either the foreign land or to the other states, because the central government has clearly given a ruling saying that we have every chance of exporting anywhere in the country or outside the country. So Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan is starting a satyagraha, the rice satyagraha or the Annadata satyagraha next 18th and 19th of February. So he would be basically starting a Padayatra from Mantralayam, Andhra Pradesh, to the borders of Karnataka, and then exporting the rice in Karnataka. So Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan will be gracing our show next week on February 19th, same time, 8 a.m. PST, 9:30 p.m. IST, India Standard Time, and 10 a.m. CST Central Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So after that would be Dr. Subramanian Swamy, the man who has relentlessly pursued the 2G spectrum scam. He has unearthed the huge 2G spectrum scam that has happened in our country, Dr. Subramanian Swamy. And we have Santosh Hegde Garu, the lokaayukt, the man who was made, who was brought in, who was head of lokaayukt in Karnataka. And he is the one who has unearthed the huge mining scam that happened in Karnataka. He was the man behind many ministers, chief ministers going to jail. So we have Santosh Hegde ji coming on our show very soon. So stay tuned, friends, anywhere around the world. This is NRI Samay, and then we thank you all for coming onto the show and then listening to our show. And once again, we had a fantastic show with Dr. M V Ramana Garu, who's brought in perspectives regarding nuclear power. So thank you all. Good day and good night.
Thank you.